Please sit. My dad had told me a story about when he was in Greece, and there was 3 men that had been possessed by demons. And these 3 men were so possessed that they weren't even walking on their own feet. They were actually walking on the ground on their behinds. And they were so strong, and this was a modern story, they were so strong that they were able to stop cars in the street with their bare hands. So at one point, of course, part of the priest's job, or part of our spiritual authority, is actually to exorcise demons. So 2 or 3 priests came out, and they were going to do the exorcism. And when they came, these men looked up and pointed at them and said, "You have done this sin, you have done this sin, and you have done this sin, and this sin, and this sin." And the priests were so embarrassed that they shielded their faces and ran away of embarrassment and fear. And then sometime after, another priest came. And this man was wearing a kind of a ratty robe, kind of had holes, was a little bit dirty. And when these 3 men saw this man, they covered their eyes and shielded their face. And he took them into the church, and he did the exorcism, and he commanded the demons to leave out of the smallest toe of their foot and to never return. Today we celebrate St. John Climacus. And right here, I have the ladder. St. John Climacus wrote a book called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. The ladder contained 33 steps, one for each year of life that Jesus lived on the earth. And as you progress up, you started going and eliminating some of the sins and gaining more virtue. But really, the ladder of divine ascent was initially written for somebody that was already a monk, an ascetic, somebody that already had given away all their earthly possessions and given up their life and put themselves in this position to live as an ascetic, to focus on their spiritual walk with God. Today we use ladders for all types of reasons. Obviously this is a ladder used to climb up to fix something, a tool. But all the ladders are tools, even the ladder of divine ascent. But today we also have the ladder that goes up in the corporate world, right? We have the ladder that goes up to success. The ladder that goes to make sure that we can get to a place that we can have success. So really, the letter of the ladder, unless you really understand it, is kind of lost to most people because it was written for the ascetics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to envision something for me. I want you to look at the ladder, this particular ladder, like this. I want you to look at it. Now, oftentimes we, as we're going through and we are celebrating and getting prepared for Pascha, we look at our spiritual walk. And the fasting and everything that we do in this world and this life and our walk with God, but especially during Lent, we look at our fast and we are supposed to go to what? The crucifixion. This is our task. This is our goal during Holy Week, is to make it to our crucifixion. But the crucifixion is only one step toward going there, right? When Jesus was crucified on the cross, and before him, when St. John the Baptist was beheaded, he went down into Hades and he proclaimed that someone was coming, that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. So Jesus then went into Hades and he proclaimed the good news to those who had died beforehand. Everybody that had died from when Jesus was crucified before, he went and pronounced the good news. So, not only do we get crucified, but sometimes, and oftentimes in our lives, we find ourselves in hell. We find ourselves in this place where it seems like we can't pull ourselves out of. And that road, as Jesus said, the path to destruction is wide, inviting. I remember when I was a kid, and I used to sing it, because it was just a song to me, but how powerful the song was. When I was a kid, there was a band that said, "A highway to hell." There's no speed limits, there's no stop signs. It's a path that you can get there quickly. So I want you to look. I want you to look on this side first of all. There is still a pathway down, but there's big gaps in it. But you can still get there. There's pitfalls. There's ways to get through here, but there's places where you can fall. There's places where you can get lost. This path right here, as you're going down, is something that we often find ourselves being lost in. And if you look at it closely, this side of the ladder does have these big gaps. And at one point during our descent into hell, as we find ourselves and look at ourselves and judge ourselves rightly, we begin to see all the sins and all the things and all the people that don't belong in our life. And I say people because sometimes some of the people that we have in our lives are toxic as well. But those sins that are in our lives, those things that don't belong, the closer you get to God, the more you realize that it doesn't belong in your life. And then, once you get past the point, you come to this point where you get crucified. And then at the very bottom, when you're finally at the bottom of the ladder, you find yourself in hell. And that's when you can start to look up and the grace of God begins to flow. It's always there. The grace is always there. The grace is always flowing. No matter how far away from God we are, no matter how lost we become, God's grace is always there. But when we're on this side of the ladder, it seems like we're alone. It seems like we've been forgotten. Remember Jesus sitting in the Garden of Gethsemane? Even he felt that he had been abandoned. He was sweating drops of blood because he was so stressed. He was sweating drops of blood because he was so afraid. Not of what the men were going to do, not of those things, but he was afraid of what he had to endure because of his human side. But he knew he had to do it. He knew he had to go forward, and he knew he had to find that cross. But he also knew that the cross was not the end, but it was only the beginning of the path that God, his Father, had set him out to do. That is the pivotal point for all of us. The cross. We celebrate last week, the cross. That is the pivotal point. As I said, that cross is something that we can look to as a symbol of hope. Because everybody that had ever been alive before was shed, the blood that was shed there was meant for them, and everybody that would be born until his return, his blood was shed for them as well. So as we begin to make our way back up, we're still shedding things off, because we're still making this progression. We're still going up. We're still moving up on the rungs. And the last thing that John Climacus talks about, the last thing that he finds, the last thing that he needs to bring to attention is love. He had already gotten rid of, and he instructs his people of all the things that have been going on in their lives. Gluttony and sexual immorality and all the things that we see today. Anybody that watches the TV just for a little bit, every commercial bombards your senses. Every commercial bombards all the things that they want you to do. Every woman must look a certain way. Every guy must look a certain way. We must eat this certain food. We must live this certain way. And if John Climacus was here today, he would be rolling around, and he would probably be pulling his hair out today at what is being seen. But imagine what he could have written today. Because as he progressed, as he found his way down there, and when he wrote this book, he had probably already been crucified. He had already probably found himself in hell, and he was on his way back up. And he was starting to shed more and more sins along the way. He was going and finding himself closer and closer to God. Now, today, the reading, as we read the gospel, we have, as I described in what I described at the beginning of my sermon, is the disciples would go up to the demon-possessed boy, and they couldn't cast it out. And Jesus says, only by prayer and fasting can you do this. But could it have been more? Could it have been that they were not prepared? They weren't prepared because they weren't fasting and praying. They weren't doing the things that they were supposed to do. And Jesus looks at the man and says, how long has this boy been like this? And says, as long as I can remember. He says, only if you believe. If you believe, it can be done. And what does the man reply? I believe, but help me with my unbelief. Think about that statement for a minute. I believe, help me with my unbelief. It's a powerful statement. And Jesus looks at the man who is possessed and casts out the demon and demands him never to come back. The demon threw himself wildly and then came out of the boy, and it was like he was dead. That boy had been possessed so long, he had been so possessed in his life that he didn't know what life really was, and he was like he was dead. How many people do we know that have been so saturated, so involved, so given over to sin that they don't know how to live life without it? You can see these people that are living on the streets that are prostitutes. All the people that are worshiping in all these temples around the world. They don't know how to live any other way. But Jesus says, only if you believe. Lord, help me with my unbelief. Lord, help me so I can believe. And as I progress up this state, as I progress here, I think to myself, Lord, will I be one day called to do an exorcism myself? And if I go up to somebody that's possessed, what will the demon see? Not what will the man see, but what will the demon see? What will he see in me? That's why as I climb the ladder, as I find myself warring with my own self, I want to get to the point where I can look at the mirror and I see only Christ reflecting back at me. I want to see only Jesus reflecting back at me. I remember there was a book that I had read years ago, and it was about this man who had a vision. And he had this vision of this great army coming against the mountain. And on the top of the mountain, there was God. And as he progressed and worked his way towards the base of the mountain, he found so much blood and warfare at the bottom, arrows and wounds and everything else, in the trenches around the mountain. And as he progressed, he found himself walking closer and closer up to the mountain, and he found himself walking up towards the mountain. As he progressed higher and higher into the mountain, up onto the top, he saw less and less bloodshed as he progressed. And he said, I feel so bad for the people that are behind me. And as he finally made it all the way up to the top, he saw God at the top of the mountain, which showed him all these things. He says, Lord, but what about all these people at the bottom? He says, oh, well, those are the people that are still fighting the war. And because of their blood, because of their sacrifice, you're able to use them as a stepping stool to get higher onto the mountain. That's what some of us are called to do. And some of us are called to go up onto the mountain. But some of us are called to stay in the trenches of the war. But still, we have to progress up the ladder. We have to progress up to the top. Our goal as Christians is to make it to the top, and make it to the top of the mountain, and for our Lord and Savior to say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That's my goal. And I hope that's everybody else's goal. I hope that that's something that everybody else will focus on during this Lent. I challenge you to go home. And last week, we went over the 12 steps. But I challenge you to take up those 12 steps. And I challenge you to look at yourself closely in the mirror, because that's what this Lent is all about, is focusing not selfishly on yourself, but spiritually on yourself, to where do I need to be and where do I need to go? Where am I in my walk with God? Where am I in my service to the Lord? Just because I'm a priest doesn't mean that I'm any holier than anybody else. There is much more people out there that are more holy than I will ever be. But I pray that I can reach to those places. Everybody that we look at on these walls have walked that walk, have climbed the ladder of divine ascent. Some of them were martyred, some of them lived to an old age, but every one of them, if you asked them if they were holy, their first answer would be no. Because not one person is worthy of the grace of God. But by the shedding of Jesus' blood, He made us worthy. He made us worthy enough to come into the kingdom. And we, who are the Gentiles, were grafted onto that vine. We were allowed into that grace. We were allowed onto that glory that is Jesus Christ's throne. We need to get closer to God as a society. Because as time goes on, I remember as I was growing up, grandparents saying there's no way that this world can get any worse. And now I'm thinking to myself, when I was growing up, there's no way this world can get any worse. And now as my kids are growing up, I'm like going, oh my Lord, how is this world going to get any worse? We need to teach our kids and teach the people around us what it is to be a servant of Jesus Christ. My goal is to hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," when I reach the top of the ladder. And hopefully one day I can truly understand what that love truly means. Amen.